I'm Jim. Welcome to my shop. I want to cover some topics today related to experimental and home-built aircraft that come up frequently in online discussion groups and on YouTube comments and things. And I think there's a lot of confusion, and I've tried to do the research here so I can give you a reasonably concise overview. So I'll cover the so-called 51% rule for experimental amateur-built aircraft. Repairman certificate, what is it good for? Short answer is it lets you do condition inspections. Who can work on an experimental amateur-built aircraft? Short answer is anyone. And I'll wrap up with some comments on buying a project or buying an already flying experimental amateur-built aircraft like I have. I will put links to the regulations and advisory circulars that I reference in the description, and I will point out that I am not an A&P, I'm not a DAR, I'm not an FAA official, anything, just a guy who owns and maintains an experimental amateur-built aircraft. To start out, I want to talk about the different types of experimental aircraft per the FAA. The most common example, and the kind that I own, is an experimental amateur-built aircraft. To quote FAR 21.191G, this is an aircraft, the major portion of which has been fabricated or assembled by persons, plural, who undertook the construction project solely for their own education or recreation. So some key things, talk about the major portion, which leads us to the 51% rule, which I'll get into in detail. And another thing is it does not need to be built exactly according to the plans. Okay, if you want to put the tail feathers from a Cessna 172 on the back of your RV7 because you think it just looks cool, you can do that. Okay, Vans may not approve, but Vans isn't the manufacturer, you are. I see a lot of cases where somebody building a project, Jason Ellis is an example, he checks with Vans about everything, and that's fine, that's great, that works for him. I also see where somebody will be in the comments, well, did you check with Vans or did you check with KitFox? And while it certainly doesn't hurt, if you want to deviate, it's on you. You can do that. Some other type of experimental aircraft, experimental light sport aircraft, E-LSA, FAR 21.191 covers that. This is either a kit that is a copy of an S-LSA, Special Light Sport Aircraft, built to the ASTM consensus standards, or it is an S-LSA that is converted to E-LSA. There are regs allow for that. It does not need to meet the 51% rule, which is nice if you want to go that route. But when you first build it, it does have to be built per the instructions. It has to be a copy of that S-LSA. You can't change the engine. You can't change the avionics. You can't. Once it's completed as an E-LSA, you can do modifications as long as you stay inside the boundaries for light sport aircraft as defined in the FARs in section 1.1. So the advantage of experimental amateur built is you can modify it and you don't need to strictly follow the kit rules. The advantage of experimental LSA is you don't need to meet the 51% rule, and there's a couple things related to condition inspections which we'll get to further down the road. Another somewhat common category is experimental exhibition. To quote 21.191 Delta, exhibiting the aircraft's flight capabilities, performance, or unusual characteristics at air shows, motion picture, television, and similar productions, and the maintenance of exhibition flight proficiency, blah, blah, blah. And there's a similar one for air racing. If you're familiar with Mike Patey and Draco, this is the route that he's taken, so he could take a production certified aircraft and convert it to experimental and get insane with it. Another example would be somebody like Greg Panzel, who builds high-performance aerobatic aircraft. Again, those are experimental exhibition aircraft. And to get your aircraft certified under those rules, you need to submit program letters explaining what you're going to do, where you're going to exhibit it, what makes it unique, things like that. Another category, 21.191A, is research and development. If you want to hang a Cummins 6-cylinder diesel on your 172 to test it to develop an STC, that's what works, okay? If you want to just somehow convert to this category so you can take your wife and dog up north and back home and not have to pay an A&P for maintenance, good luck on that one. So let's get into the 51% rule here. Recall, 21-191 Gulf, an aircraft, the major portion of which has been fabricated and assembled by persons who undertook the construction project solely for their own education or recreation. Persons is plural, okay? So it doesn't mean that one person has to do 51%. It can be 10 guys each doing 10%. That's all cool, okay? Or 5.1%. An important point here is solely for education or recreation as opposed to getting paid, and we'll walk through some of those scenarios. And then the major portion, it does not mean 51% of the total labor that it took to construct that aircraft. It means that you scored 51% in the checklist in Appendix 8 of FAA Advisory Circular 20-27G. Link down below. There's a big difference between scoring 51% on that checklist and putting in 51% of the hours required to get from flat stock to a flying airplane. Now, Appendix 8 has 8 pages of tasks, and each task is scored against 4 categories. It can be a manufactured kit part, another category is commercial assistance, the third is amateur builder assembly, and the fourth is amateur builder fabrication. And as you complete each task, you put a score into one or more of those columns, and when you add all the columns up, the amateur columns need to be more than 51% of the total score. Okay? And I will point out, in addition to the advisory circular, there is an 83-page job aid, amateur built fabrication and assembly checklist that covers the 8 pages of the checklist with pictures and examples and all kinds of information. Again, I will link that down in the description as well. Okay? But what makes this different from the hours or things is each of these tasks counts exactly the same when you add up all the scores, okay? And the magnitude of the tasks can range from calibrate fuel system components, which, an afternoon, maybe a day, and fabricate fuselage covering or skin, weeks potentially, right? To lay out the skins, drill them, cut them. That's a big job. But in that checklist, they count exactly the same. So imagine, for example, you fabricate and install the control sticks. Okay, that's 2 tasks in the checklist. And you hire somebody to fabricate wing spars, which is 1 task. You spend a day, he spends 2 weeks, but your score in that checklist for those items alone is 67%. You're ahead of the game, even though you haven't done nearly as much grunt work. And that's how a lot of the 2-week to taxi and builder assist programs work. They do the time-consuming, repetitive drilling, deburring, dimpling, and you flit around and maybe make 1 rib for the experience, do a little here on this, install the landing gear, install the sticks, all these little tasks all over the airplane, and you can end up with the score of 51% in the 2 amateur columns. I guess I should go like this because you're looking this way and they're on this side when you're looking at the sheet. And you can still qualify for an experimental amateur built certificate. Now, one of the things that people get hung up on is amateur versus professional. The word professional does not appear in the regulation, and while the checklist and the name of the experimental category use the word amateur, the key is in 21.191G, where it says persons who undertook the construction project solely for their own education or recreation. So if you're an A&P, you can build an experimental amateur-built aircraft even though you are a professional in the aircraft field, as long as you're doing it for your own education or recreation. That's legit. And A&Ps build home builds all the time. That's cool. And the fact that somebody is a professional does not preclude putting their tasks in the amateur categories. And conversely, if somebody is an amateur in the sense of aircraft maintenance, say your landscaping guy, okay, but you pay him to drill all the holes in the fuselage skins and do all the dimpling and do all the deburring just because it's so time consuming and repetitive and you don't want to do it, that work, that task that he completes, or that portion of the task he completes, falls under commercial assistance because he's doing it to get paid, not for his education and or recreation. Some other things, there are things that are not on that checklist. Engine, propellers, wheels and brakes, avionics. That stuff doesn't count for or against you, whether you buy it or build your own engine from castings. It's just not part of the process according to FAA. They just expect you to buy it, and we don't want to count that as part of what it takes to build an aircraft. So that's something to consider. Paint and interior, a couple other things. So another gotcha is if you did decide to take the tail feathers off that 172, you bought the tail end of a wreck and tore them all apart and made a couple new ribs for it because the old ones were damaged, and cleaned up the skins and completely rebuilt them from ground up. None of that work counts. Okay, those are type certificated parts, and the FAA counts that as performing alterations, repairs, and rebuilding of previously type certificated articles. And that's why you can't take your 172 or take a salvage 172 and tear it down completely and put 20 million hours in it and try to certify it as experimental amateur built. Even if you replaced 3/4 of the aluminum, it was a previously type certificated aircraft, and the FAA has decreed that that doesn't count. Another semi-gotcha, you have fun building airplanes. I have fun building things. I'm about to retire. Maybe you're going to retire. Maybe we could make this into our full-time gig. Hang a shingle out and say, hey, I'll build your airplane for you for so many dollars an hour or whatever. No, that doesn't work, right? You're not doing it for education and recreation. You're doing it specifically for pay, or you're claiming you're doing it for pay, okay? On the other hand, there are lots of people whose hobby is building aircraft. They build it and they like building, they don't like flying, so they sell it and they build another one and they sell it, and maybe they make a profit and then they build another one and they sell it. And that's cool as long as they're officially doing that for education and recreation, doing it as a hobby. So if you want to do this for a living, could you get away with it? Maybe, if you're building them to spec. My understanding, it is extremely rare for a DAR to reject an aircraft for not having sufficient amateur content, but I'm certainly not going to say that it can't happen. Another potential gotcha is documentation. To quote the advisory circular again, to issue an airworthiness certificate, the FAA must make a major portion determination. The major portion of an aircraft was fabricated and assembled by an amateur builder or builders. Making this finding requires sufficient, credible, and adequate documentation. Now, you may know that guy, or you know a guy who knows a guy who didn't document anything. He didn't take pictures. He didn't do a builder's log. And I'm sure there's lots of them out there, and I'm sure a lot of people have gotten away with it. But you don't want to be the poster child for screwing up. When the DAR shows up, it says, we're doing this by the book. Where's your documentation? And you just, don't be that guy. And another thing in the document area, particularly if you buy a partially built kit, is the FAA wants documentation of all the stuff you got. To quote Advisory Circular 2027G again, If you are not the original purchaser of an uncompleted kit, provide AFS-750 traceability from the kit manufacturer through the previous builder or builders to yourself. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you go. Keep documents about where you got your stuff. And the FAA suggests that you visit your local FSDO to discuss your plans before you start. If you're buying a partially built project, I'd seriously consider that, especially if it's you're buying it from an estate and documentation is sketchy. And yeah, before you put a lot of time and money into it, make sure that this thing's going to fly. You don't want to end up putting a couple thousand hours into a very nice looking piece of artwork. Now, for the proverbial repairman certificate. Per 65-104, the FAA may issue a repairman certificate to one individual for one particular experimental amateur-built aircraft. And that repairman certificate lets you perform the condition inspections every year for that aircraft. Period. That's all it gets you. Having a repairman certificate lets you do condition inspections on an experimental amateur-built aircraft. Some people think that's a big deal. Personally, I don't. I don't have the repairman certificate for the airplane I own. Obviously not. I bought it already flying. So, once a year I pay my buddy Steve, ace mechanic, to do the inspection. It's not that big a deal for me. I do a lot of the disassembly and grunt work. Steve does the inspection. A second set of eyes isn't a bad thing. It's just not a big deal to have to pay somebody for the condition inspection. Now, there are A&Ps that will not do that. They think that experimental aircraft are just a horrible liability and you may cost them their license because who knows what. But I don't think it's a big problem finding A&Ps. For me, it was a non-issue because I knew Steve from a long time ago and he knows my work and we're cool. But generally, it doesn't seem to be a problem. But it's not guaranteed that an A&P or AI is going to do that for you. So, assuming you did build it, you're one of the builders, the requirements are you must be 18. They talk about a primary builder, but that doesn't appear to mean 51%. It just appears to mean that you had to be significantly involved. And to quote, you need to be able to show to the satisfaction of the administrator that the individual has the requisite skill to determine whether the aircraft is in a condition for safe operation. That's probably the big thing there. They may, if you were buying in late, bought a project that's 90% done, or you're one of 50 people that worked on this airplane, they may quiz you somewhat deeply before they give you the certificate, and they may not give you one. Okay, it happens apparently, but it's not a big deal. And I should also say there are repairman certificates for light sport aircraft. If you take a 16-hour course, you can get a repairman certificate that authorizes you to do condition inspections on any E-LSA aircraft you own, but just E-LSA. Okay? My experimental amateur-built aircraft qualifies as a light sport aircraft under FAR 1.1, so I can fly it under the sport pilot rules. But if I were to take that class, I couldn't do the condition inspection because my certificate is EAB, not E-LSA. And there is an additional light sport repairman certificate with a maintenance rating for an airplane that's a 120-hour course that lets you work and sign off the work for any SLSA, not counting major repairs or major alterations, which require additional training. But again, that's SLSA certificates. You don't need it for EAB or E-LSA, and it doesn't apply to standard category production aircraft. Which brings us to maintaining experimental amateur-built or experimental light sport aircraft. Who can do it? Again, the short answer is anyone. You don't need a repairman certificate. You do not need to be one of the builders. I maintain my EAB aircraft. Okay. Where does it say I can do that? Simple. 43.1b. Part 43 in the regulations is the section which talks about A&Ps and certificates and the requirements for logbooks and the requirements to sign things off to put them back into airworthy condition. But 43.1b says this part does not apply to any aircraft for which the FAA has issued an experimental certificate, blah, blah, blah. Now, what does apply is your operating limitations, and those have changed over the years somewhat. But, for example, the operating limitations will say that you have to do the condition inspection every year or within the preceding 12 calendar months per Appendix D of Part 43, even though Part 43 doesn't generally apply, okay? Because you can let anybody do the work on your experimental amateur-built aircraft. Does that mean you should? I can't answer those questions, really, because it's up to you. You know, what's your skill level? What's your comfort level? Remember, it's your butt on the line here, okay, and potentially your family's butts. It's not like you're building a steam engine that's going to go sit on top of a file cabinet forever and just gather dust. Me personally, I do all the work on my aircraft except for the actual inspection every year. I'm comfortable doing it. I've been working on things like cars, motorcycles, boats, even airplanes, construction equipment, robots since I was about 14 or so. Now, I'm not going to say how long ago it was that I was 14. I've got copies of the FAA Advisory Circular 43.13, the Acceptable Methods and Practices. I've been through the Aircraft Maintenance Technician Handbook. I've got the manual from Polyfiber. I've got the manuals from Rotax. I've got the original construction manual from the kit manufacturer. There's other resources out there for you, okay? If you have the experience and confidence and you're willing to look things up and maybe pay your A&P to look over your shoulder when you're not sure, or at least talk to them, yeah, that's a real advantage to owning an E-LSA or EAB aircraft, is you can save some money on the labor for maintenance. Parts, on the other hand, that depends, you know. I recently fabricated new fuel tanks from flat stock, so it wasn't too expensive. I spent a few $100s, bought a lot of sheet aluminum and generated a fair amount of scrap. But in the end, I've got tanks that I hope won't split like the original tanks kept doing. So you know that saves me some money. It traded off against a lot of labor. But you know, parts for my Rotax, no, they're not cheap. You know, parts for your O360, yeah, they cost the same for any other O360. Some of the avionics things are cheaper, but you know, it's not a free ride. Finally, let me wrap this up by commenting on buying an already flying airplane or partially built kits. I bought mine already flying, I already said that, but a common thing that people have, they don't want to buy somebody else's airplane because, well, what if that builder forgot a bolt and the wings fall off? If you've hung around an airport long enough, somebody has probably told you that there's never been a case where the wings have fallen off a Cessna 172 in flight. I can tell you that whoever told you that has never actually looked in the NTSB database, because if you look in the NTSB database, you will find that there are a few instances where they have fallen off. At least one of them because somebody forgot to put a nut on the end of a bolt, one of the bolts that holds a strut on, and when that bolt came out, the wings folded up and several people died. A type certificate is not a shield against somebody forgetting to put a bolt in. But, you know, what is the relative risk? Ron Wantaya, and I'm sure I totally butchered that pronunciation, has done a lot of analysis for Kit Planes magazines, written a number of articles. I'll put a link to one of them below, and from there you can find some of his other articles. Well worth reading if this is a concern of yours. Some of the big takeaways is that most of the builder errors happen in the first 20-40 hours. You know, the forgotten bolts, the misrun fuel lines, those tend to happen fairly early. Accidents tend to be more due to a home builder screwing up the fuel system than forgetting a big structural element. If you followed my channel, you will know that I have replaced the entire fuel system from the gascolator all the way back to the tanks. And now I even replaced the tanks because I didn't like the way it was run. I didn't like the materials they used. I didn't like the valves. So I kind of straightened that stuff up. There's no guarantee one way or the other. You really need to have a mechanic that you can trust, look at things. Ideally, if you're buying a flying aircraft, drag the A&P that's going to do your condition inspections with you so that you don't get that, you got to be kidding, the first condition inspection, right? Buyer beware, home built or site or certified. From a cost of acquisition perspective, for RVs and kit foxes, you're going to pay a premium for the brand name, okay? Other things, Whitman Tailwinds, T-18s, Avid Flyers, my Merlin GT, you can get a lot of airplane for the buck. I paid less for my already flying airplane than a new kit would have cost, and certainly less than a new Rotax 912 would have cost, okay? So I got the airplane and the engine for the less than the price of one. But again, that depends on the brand. If you're looking for an RV10, you're going to be paying a premium. Partially built projects, I've looked at experimentals over the years, mine and others. I've seen good work, I've seen bad work, and I think you can generally spot it. Again, bring your A&P or some expert in that particular type to look at it for you. Don't be afraid of doing that. I mentioned documentation. Again, if you're buying from an estate and you're lacking in documentation, be careful. Talk to the FSDO or DAR. Make sure that's going to work for you. I think I mentioned that the FAA suggests that you visit the FSDO before you start the project. Again, seriously consider that if you're buying a partially complete project and you're not sure about the documentation or you just want that comfortable feeling. DARs can and on rare occasions will issue denials for different reasons. There was an article about that in the August 2020 Sport Aviation. But it seems like most of the problem areas are things that you can fix as you build. Okay. With that, I think I've babbled long enough. If you're still with me, thanks for hanging in there. If you're still awake, I hope that your doctor is able to help you with your insomnia, and I'll catch you on the flip side.